Have core values on your website, but they don't really drive the ministries of your church? We're talking about how that threatens your church today on the Church Revitalization podcast.
Hello, and welcome to the Church Revitalization podcast, brought to you by the Malfers Group team, where each week we tackle important, actionable topics to help churches thrive. And now, here's your hosts, Scott Ball and AJ Matthew.
Welcome to the Church Revitalization podcast. My name is Scott Ball. I'm joined by my friend and co-host, AJ Matthew. If you tuned in last week, we were not in this country. We were overseas in Europe. We were in France. I was in the background sipping some cafe au lait. And AJ was talking with Danny Laverty, one of our guides that lives in Sweden. So if you didn't check out last week's episode, hear that conversation with Danny. And if you watch it on YouTube, you can see me lurking in the background.
Yeah, so if you missed Scott being front and center, go back and catch that one.
But today we're back recording the way that we normally do. We're glad to be back here stateside. So wherever you're listening to this, wherever around the world, thanks for listening. Today we're talking about core values. AJ, when we were in Europe, one of the things that I noticed is that all of these beautiful landmarks, places, I'm thinking even something like the Place de la Concorde, where there's that big Egyptian obelisk. They had scaffolding around it because if they don't do the hard work of preserving some of these classic works of art, in that case, it's an Egyptian obelisk, so it's really, really, really old. These things tend to erode over time without constant attention and preservation. And in our churches, we have things like our core values or our mission or our vision that can erode without protection and preservation and attention.
Yeah.
And specifically today, we're talking about core values and this idea that our values can be threatened by three things in particular. And these things, if we allow them unchecked, AJ, they will erode at our values. And so how many times have we been in churches where we're working with the church, we're on their website, they've got a values statement, or maybe it's printed somewhere, and yet when we look around, those values, at least maybe some of them, don't really seem apparent.
Yeah, for sure. I think this is just kind of coming to me right now. Core values, and this will be interesting too. I'm going to go ahead and put this out there. Core values historically in the past has not been our higher listened to episodes. It's not an attractive topic, I think, for a lot of people. And I think it's because I don't think they understand how deep core values should be maintained in the church, and how to really use core values as a tool in the church, and how valuable they are in managing conflict in the church. So every church, just about every church we come across, is going to have core values on their website. I think every church leader understands, hey, when we're planting a church, or, every now and then, we should just, let's make sure that we establish our values. And it's like a one and done thing. It's, it's this obligatory exercise, but it's not like an active driver for the church. And I think that's probably why when we put out something that has core values in the title, it's probably not going to get as many clicks as something else, because I think people think, oh yeah, we did that. I'm glad you're listening today. And I hope you are one of those church leaders that says, we have core values. What am I really supposed to do with them? I hope that is you today, because I want you to hear what we have to say.
Well, and on that note, AJ, and I don't want to get stuck here, I really do want to get into the meat of this, but one of the things we teach the churches that we work with is that the question is not, do you have core values? Mm-hmm. It's what are they, and which values really run deep, and which ones do you really act out and live out of? And sometimes our core values can be good and healthy. Those are the ones that are probably on your website, the ones that you say that you value. And then we can also have core values that are unhealthy, things that are not holy, things that are detrimental to us. We sometimes call these anti-values, things that are unhealthy that take us off course, but churches can grow to value them. So it's not a question of whether or not you have core values, it's what are those? So the premise of today's episode, though, AJ, is that that a church does have values, and that they are good and healthy, and that they are worth preserving, and they are worth keeping. and worth kind of rooting all of their decisions and behaviors and actions out of. So given that basic assumption, what erodes, what threatens good, healthy core values? There's three things we're going to talk about today, and maybe we can just hop straight into it.
Yeah. And well, let's also take a moment just to plug Values Driven Leadership book by Dr. Aubrey Malphurs. A lot of the content that we're talking today, you can find in this book, and it's a really great deep dive into values of the church. On with the show, 3 threats. The first one that we're going to talk about is conflict in the church. This has probably never happened in your church, but in some people's churches, conflict arises from time to time. And how conflict gets settled more frequently is not by leaning into the values of the church. That is not the typical response by church leaders, is to say, okay, we have a situation happening. Let's go back to our core values to settle this. And so we're saying that's what the response should be, to circle the wagons around what we have stated we hold dear and true, so that we can then begin to maybe, influence or re-influence the source of this conflict with what we know to be right and what we're about. So conflict, can end up leading you, when the values don't become central in working through conflict, you can end up abandoning the value for the sake of peacekeeping and just working through it. And the values just sort of get cast aside. And, and again, if these aren't front and center in your organization, then that's more likely what's going to happen when conflict arises.
Yeah. Aubrey does a great job in the book outlining an actual kind of a biblical example of this. So we have in Acts chapter 2, which is where we like to go to point out values of a church. We have in Acts chapter 2 that the Jerusalem church did have great values that they were living out. They're both descriptive and prescriptive. We see this sort of this tapestry, this tableau, this moment in time, the snapshot of a healthy church and how it ought to be operating. And so, if the book stopped at Acts chapter 2, verse 47, you might go, wow, things were really good for them. And except that that's not where the book ends. There are just a couple of chapters later in Acts chapter 6, we have a conflict among the people with the Greek Jews feeling like they're widows, feeling like hey, I thought we said we have all things in common. I thought that, they're kind of pointing out the values and going, I thought that this is who we were. And this is who we said we are. And it doesn't feel like it. Feels like we're getting overlooked. Feels like we're getting mistreated here in this community.
Cultural conflict.
Cultural conflict, definitely. And so the apostles have a choice to make here in how they're going to deal with this situation. They can either lean into their values and let that guide and influence the way that they respond to it, or they can lean away from it or do something differently. And so we see a great leadership from the apostles and saying, you know what, you're right. We said that we're going to have all things in common. We said that we're going to serve. We said we're going to do all these things. And we're realizing that the reason why we're not fully living out that value that we genuinely have is because we are the bottleneck. And so they recognized that, and it led them to a strategic change. So sometimes, AJ, we think that our living out our values means things will never change. But no, if very often living out our values will lead us to engage in a strategic change that allows us to live that value out even more effectively. So they appoint these deacons to serve, to manage the daily distribution of food, so it's done in a more equitable way, and it resolves this conflict. So they leaned into their values. They checked this situation against their values and realized, yes, now there's this gap, this integrity gap between who we say we are and what we're actually doing. And so we're going to lean into this value. We're going to make sure that we're doing it the right way. And they implement a strategic change to ensure that they live out that value more effectively. So that's the way to resolve that. But very often churches don't do this, AJ. Conflict comes up. And so they succumb to this second threat to our values.
Let me point out just for kind of for this example. So the values that, I think became threatened and started to get pushed aside in this, two values, I think fellowship and generosity that we see in Acts chapter 2 were the values that had been established that became threatened because of this conflict. So, this lack of, I guess, fairness. I don't know if fairness necessarily was the value, but being generous and fellowshipping universally in the church was certainly a value. And this conflict between the Hebraic widows, Grecian widows, began to sever that. And so they had to reset. Like, we value generosity, we value fellowship, and therefore we need to restore, the unity here in the church. So just want to kind of put a little bit of specificity to it, like what was the value and what was the problem.
That's good.
So that's conflict resolution by leaning into the values, resetting back to what we value first. And then the second piece that we're talking about, the second threat to your values, is compromising between conflicting parties by just giving a little bit. We'll lighten up on this value that we hold, this us and them, us against them. We'll lighten up on this portion of the value that we hold to make things right with you, because you maybe don't value the same thing that we do, which should have been, and probably at one time we had order and unity in the values. Something has happened in which a party, some group, sometimes doesn't even take a very large group, have either lost sight of the value or changed what they personally value. And now we have conflict. And again, what we're talking about today, going back to the values to restore order.
Yeah. I don't want to make this too political, but I think it would be helpful to maybe give a specific kind of example where this might come up in a contemporary church or a modern church. The culture's values, the cultural sexual ethic in particular, has changed a lot in the last 50 years, 60 years. And so in an attempt to maintain good relationship with the community or with certain people in the congregation, a church may be tempted to compromise its value of scriptural authority or maintaining standards of biblical sexual ethics or whatever, in order to keep nice, to keep peace with their neighbors or with people in the congregation or with the community and so on. And so churches have a choice to make. They go, are we really going to lean into this value of maintaining scriptural authority, or are we going to compromise a bit and go, well, maybe Jesus didn't mean exactly that? And so I'm not trying to get too political or step on anyone's toes, but there's a real danger, I think, not just with sexual ethics, but with anything where we start to go, well, we want to keep peace here. And so we're willing to compromise on any of these things to keep peace. But keeping peace is not the same as making peace. And very often, in an attempt to keep peace, we lose the ability to make peace, and we certainly compromise our values. And so any sort of consensus that we build then, as Aubrey points out, is a false consensus. It's just an avoidance of conflict rather than working through it. And so at the end of the day, your values can often be heavily eroded by avoiding the conflict and choosing to compromise instead.
Yeah. I don't necessarily care how unpopular this statement may be, but church boards, the primary responsibility of a church board would be to maintain and defend the values of the church, which includes scriptural integrity and all the other things, especially what we see in Acts 2. Their primary responsibility is not to maintain peace in the church. Peace, sacrificing the values for peace, is a road to ruin. Unless the values originally were not biblically sound.
Yeah, I was going to say, unless the values were bad. Yep. we're making an assumption that the established values are healthy ones.
That's right. Yeah. Yes. So, I mean, I think, especially if you're an elder in a church, if you're, a deacon, an overseer, a pastor, whatever, senior level decision makers and overseers of the church that you might be, I think that's important for you to remember. This also should help drive what your focus is as a church board or, board of overseers, the kinds of things that you should be focused on. And it should be maintaining the values of the church. I think if you have that as your umbrella over your board, it's going to help focus the decisions that you make and how you make them.
Yeah, I mean, this is difficult, and I don't want to make it sound like this is so simple. It's not simple, but this is why Jesus says that he has not come to bring peace, but a sword. That very often his truth is going to cause pain. Not least of which within us. I mean, I think it starts here. I think I can't speak for anyone else but myself here, AJ, but very often my rush to judgment gets halted a little bit a judgment of others, because there's judgment on myself that I'm not living in full integrity the way that I need to. And so the worst thing I could do is to compromise on biblical authority rather than letting that biblical authority speak into my heart and try to bring forth greater integrity. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Amen.
So if what you're hearing is, oh, well, then boards should be bullies. No, you shouldn't be a bully, because very often a commitment to that scriptural integrity. I know we're kind of highlighting scriptural integrity, but that's just one of any values that you could compromise on. We're using it as an example, but an adherence to that value is very likely to pierce yourself first. And so when you then come and defend that value, if you're doing it right, I doubt you're going to come as a bully. You're going to come as a broken person saying, I cannot compromise on this because I need it to pierce my own heart. Mm-hmm. And cause me to confess and cause me to change my behavior. And if we compromise on this, I don't know what person I'll become.
You're bringing up kind of a good point. So let's spend just another minute talking about the opposite way in which this can be used as a sword, and that's when the programs of the church become too closely associated with the values, in which a board then may become such a bully pulpit for how we do things in the church and calling it the values of the church, and not willing to compromise on things that don't affect the values, but it's just the way we express our values. And a healthy board needs to be able to separate those things. And you see this a lot, in the area of worship. We value worship, therefore this is how we always will do it. And then they'll say, well, we're not going to compromise on our value of worship. You would not be.
I see what you're saying.
Yeah, you would not be by simply doing, expressing worship in maybe a slightly different way. So
okay, I see what you're saying.
Example.
Okay, that's a good example. So going, all right, we have this value, say, of worship, and then we use an organ to express our worship. Well, we associate those things together. So if we remove the organ, then we're compromising on the value of worship. I see what you're saying.
Right.
Yeah. So it does take maybe some discernment to be able to figure out what is the value and what is the mechanism that is what is the program or what is the mechanism for using that value or
the expression of the value.
The expression of it. And going, okay, if we compromise on this, are we compromising? That's why you ought to have really effective, mature leaders on your board, because these are not easy conversations to have. Mm-hmm. It requires a lot of prayer. So, but that's actually a good segue, AJ, to the third threat to your values.
Yeah. Sort of along those lines. So the third threat to the values is institutionalization of the value. And so it's kind of where we were just going there on the end of point 2 on compromise. That is where kind of the expression of the value becomes the value itself. The program in the church loses the value that drives it to achieve an outcome, some discipleship or maturity outcome. And instead, now we're just kind of doing it because we've always done it that way.
Yeah.
And this is very common. We see this very, very frequently. The church
totally.
just has kept doing something, an event or a program. It can even come down to something as significant as Sunday school or small groups, like what is probably your primary discipleship tool in the church is no longer about discipleship, or it's no longer about teaching God's word or fellowship or service. And it's just kind of its own thing. And then people they feel the need to defend it. Like, oh no,
right.
We can't change that. I go, why can't we? What's the purpose behind it anymore?
Right. I think I can give a very specific example of this because it was just working through a church with this recently. When we evaluate programs and events and ministries in a church, we actually use our values or the church's values as the standard by which we evaluate or assess the effectiveness of a ministry. So while attendance or engagement plays some role in evaluating it, on the actual paper assessment that we're doing with the chart, it doesn't play any role. So in conversation, it might play a role, but it's not the standard by which we judge success or failure. At any rate, was working with the church, and they wouldn't mind me sharing this story. I'm fairly certain. They're a church that does upward basketball. So for those of you who are in maybe other countries, you don't know what that is. Upward basketball is a Christian program used to start like a youth basketball leagues, not just basketball. They do other sports as well. Youth sports hosted at the church, and it's an opportunity to share the gospel through sports. And it's a great program. It's a great ministry. They host churches all over the country in the U.S. do this. At any rate, this particular church was one of the very first churches to do upward in their particular area. And so, it was intended to be evangelistic. It was intended to be an outreach to reach families and young people and young families and so on. And over time, AJ, it just became institutionalized over, I don't know, a decade or more. It just became a thing that we do. We do upward, and engagement was declining significantly. There were other churches in the area that had a more successful, thriving upward program. They were just, quite frankly, doing it better. And so finding the kids to, have enough to actually have the teams and find the coaches, it just became a lot of work, but it had become institutionalized. They couldn't really think of evangelism and outreach outside of this one program, upward. And so as we started to evaluate it, AJ, we went back to the values. We went back to evangelism. We went back to service. We went back to these different things that they said, these are the standards for success. It was getting a one, on a scale from 1 to 5, they were giving it a 1 and a 1 and 1. And they were going, this isn't that. And so they ultimately decided, it felt wrong to them. Oh, I think we're going to need to get rid of upward. But once they made that decision, the relief on their faces, AJ, was like a weight had been lifted. This recognition that we can be a church that values evangelism and doesn't do upward basketball. It's hard for churches to do this. It's why you often need help through a process like strategic envisioning or someone else to help you think through these things and go, do we just have an institution, or do we actually have this value? And separating those two can be difficult.
Yeah. Let me point out, that's not always the decision that has to be made when something is out of alignment with the values. Sure. Abandoning it or aborting, stopping the ministry is not it. Sometimes it has value and it just needs to be realigned to the core values of the church. So
sometimes
great example. Don't want you to think it always means we stop what we're doing. Sometimes we just need to change it.
That's true. Yeah, that's true. In this instance, I don't know. I feel like I should defend them a little bit on why they decided to do this. There was a recognition that other churches near them were doing this exact ministry better than they could, even if they doubled down.
Yeah.
And they were realized there are other gaps in the community that they were better positioned, and they knew that they couldn't do both. We can't invest in upward and meet this other need that we're better positioned to meet.
Yeah.
Therefore, we need to reallocate our energy and resources to do the thing that we can do that someone else isn't doing.
Well, that's the point of view that we love to see churches take, that, you can't just pretend like you're, a siloed church. The church of Jesus Christ is global, and it's you, and it's that church down the street and the one across town. And so it's beneficial to you as a church to step back even outside of yourself and look at what is Christ's church doing even nearby us that help drive what our role is in the global church and how to minister to people. So I think that's a great example of
well, and the main takeaway we want people to get here, though, is that if you double down on maintaining the institution and lose sight of why you're doing it, then eventually what erodes, all you have left is the institution, and there's nothing inside of it. I mean, I do keep thinking back to being in Europe, AJ, and last week, and all the work that goes into preserving these buildings, these cathedrals, and yet you go inside and there's no worship happening. And so you have this institution of this cathedral, you have this, and it's beautiful and it looks amazing, and yet you go inside and it's empty. And you don't want that to be your church. I'm not talking about your physical space necessarily, but you have these programs, and yes, on the outside it looks like it's good and it's healthy, and and on paper you have 15 great programs and all these things, but on the inside it doesn't have a heart anymore. It doesn't have a reason for being. And that institutionalization can erode the values if you lose connection of why you're doing the thing you're doing in the first place.
Yeah. Yep. All right. Well, there you go. 3 threats to the core values of your church: conflicts, compromise, and institutionalization of your ministries, instead of always focusing on what are the healthy things that should be driving your church right out of God's word. Thanks for being with us this week. It's been episode 134. So you can read today's show notes at malfersgroup.com/134. We're glad that you were with us, and we'll be looking forward to having you back in next week.